You thought the worst was behind you. The dark night happened. The breakdown happened. The moment where everything you believed about yourself and your life cracked open and left you staring at rubble. You survived it. You read the books. You did some of the work. You started putting pieces back together. And now there's this strange feeling you can't quite name. Not the acute pain of the initial collapse. Something quieter. Something that sits in your chest like a low hum you can't locate. You look around at your rebuilt life and something still doesn't fit. And the terrifying thought you keep pushing away is this: what if it's not over? Jung spent years working with people in the middle of psychological transformation, and one of the things that frustrated him most was how badly the process was misunderstood. People treated awakening like a single event, a before and an after. A moment of crisis followed by a period of healing followed by arrival at some new, stable identity. But what Jung actually observed was nothing like that. He found that genuine awakening wasn't a moment, it was a season. And the most dangerous phase wasn't the dramatic collapse everyone associated with transformation. It was the quiet, confusing middle where people assumed the process had ended when it had barely reached its deepest work. Today, I'm going to walk you through 7 signs that your spiritual awakening is still actively unfolding, even if it doesn't look or feel the way you expected. These aren't signs that something's wrong with you. They're signs that something is still working inside you, reshaping you in ways your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. And understanding what's actually happening might be the difference between abandoning the process halfway through and allowing it to complete what it started. The first sign is that you feel strangely in between and you can't seem to land anywhere. You're not who you were before the awakening. That person is gone, and you know it. But you're also not yet whoever you're becoming. You're suspended in a gap that has no name and no map. Old friends don't quite fit anymore. Old routines feel hollow. Things that used to bring you comfort now feel like they belong to someone else's life. But nothing new has solidified to take their place. You're floating. Most people interpret this in-between state as failure. They think the awakening should have delivered them somewhere by now. They should have a new identity, a new purpose, a clear sense of who they are and where they're going. And when that clarity doesn't arrive, they panic. They start grasping at new identities, new spiritual labels, new frameworks to fill the void, anything to escape the discomfort of not knowing who they are. But Jung recognized this in-between state as one of the most critical phases of individuation. He understood that the old self has to fully dissolve before the authentic self can emerge, and dissolution doesn't happen overnight. There's a period where you're genuinely neither one thing nor another. Jung would have called this a liminal state, a threshold space where transformation is actively occurring precisely because nothing has settled yet. The discomfort of not knowing who you are isn't a sign that your awakening failed. It's a sign that your psyche is still dismantling structures that need to come down before anything real can be built. The temptation in this phase is to rush the process, to grab onto the first identity that offers relief from the ambiguity. But Jung warned that premature identity formation after an awakening was one of the most common ways people short-circuited their own transformation. They couldn't tolerate the in-between, so they settled for a slightly updated version of who they were before. And that updated version felt better than the crisis, but it wasn't the real thing. The real thing requires staying in the gap long enough for something genuine to emerge on its own. If you're in this in-between space right now, you're not stuck. You're in the eye of a storm that's still moving, and the stillness you're feeling isn't stagnation. It's the pause between what was destroyed and what hasn't yet been born. The second sign is that your tolerance for anything inauthentic has dropped to nearly zero. Conversations that used to feel normal now feel unbearable. Social performances that used to be automatic now make your skin crawl. You sit at a dinner table listening to people talk about things they don't actually care about, performing versions of themselves they don't actually believe in, and something inside you wants to scream or leave or both. You've lost the ability to pretend, and you've lost patience with other people's pretending. This isn't you becoming judgmental or difficult, though that's what people around you might say. Jung observed that one of the first casualties of genuine awakening was the persona, the social mask a person wears to fit in. Before the awakening, the mask felt like you. It was so integrated into your daily functioning that you didn't even know you were wearing it. But the awakening cracked it. And once you've seen the mask as a mask, you can't unsee it. Not on yourself and not on others. What makes this sign confusing is that it doesn't feel like progress. It feels like you've become allergic to normal life. Small talk is excruciating. Networking feels like a performance you can no longer stomach. Even relationships that used to sustain you now feel like they require a version of you that no longer exists. You're watching yourself withdraw from situations and people, and you're not sure if you're healing or just becoming antisocial. Jung would tell you this intolerance for inauthenticity is your psyche refusing to rebuild the old mask. It's a protective mechanism. Your unconscious has determined that the persona that kept you safe before was also keeping you trapped, and it's not going to let you reconstruct it without a fight. The discomfort you feel in fake environments isn't dysfunction. It's your deeper self rejecting the old operating system. And that rejection, as painful as it is socially, means the awakening is still doing its work beneath the surface. The third sign is that grief keeps arriving without a clear source. You'll be fine going about your day, and suddenly a wave of sadness rolls through you that doesn't connect to anything happening in the present moment. It's not triggered by a specific memory or a particular loss. It just shows up, heavy and real, and then eventually it passes. And then it comes back again, sometimes days later, sometimes hours. This kind of sourceless grief bewilders people. They scan their lives looking for the cause and can't find one. Nothing terrible is happening. No one died. No relationship ended. And yet the grief is unmistakable. It sits in the body like something ancient, something that goes deeper than any single event. Jung understood this grief as the psyche mourning what had to be released during the awakening process. Not just the obvious losses like relationships or beliefs, but the deeper ones that don't have names. The loss of the person you spent decades constructing. The loss of the future that person was going to have. The loss of the simple, unquestioned way you used to experience reality before you started seeing through it. These losses are real, and they're massive, but they don't show up on anyone's list of things worth grieving. So the grief arrives without a name, and you're left wondering why you're crying in the shower for no reason you can articulate. This grief often carried material from much earlier in life, wounds and losses that the old self had successfully kept buried. The awakening didn't just crack the persona, it cracked the vault underneath it. And now grief that's been stored for decades is finding its way to the surface because for the first time in your life, you're psychologically open enough to feel it. The fact that it keeps arriving means there's still material being processed. Your psyche is still clearing what was buried, and each wave, as bewildering as it feels, is the awakening continuing to do what it does. Bringing what's unconscious into consciousness so it can finally be felt, metabolized, and released. The fourth sign is that you've lost interest in convincing anyone of anything. There was probably a phase early in your awakening where you wanted to share what you were learning. You wanted to tell people about the patterns you were seeing, the psychological dynamics you were recognizing, the way reality was reorganizing itself in your perception. You recommended books. You started conversations about consciousness. You tried to explain what was happening to you because it felt so significant that surely the people who loved you would want to understand. And most of them didn't. Some were polite about it. Some were dismissive. Some actively resisted. And gradually, something shifted. You stopped trying. Not out of bitterness exactly, though maybe there's some of that too. More out of a deep recognition that what you're experiencing can't be transmitted through conversation. It has to be lived. And no amount of explaining will create understanding in someone whose psyche isn't ready for what you're describing. Jung was particularly interested in this shift because he saw it as a marker of genuine psychological maturation. The need to be understood, to have your experience validated by others, to convince people that your perception is accurate, all of that belongs to an earlier stage of development. It's the ego seeking external confirmation of internal experience. And when that need falls away, it doesn't mean you've become indifferent. It means your locus of reality has moved inward. You no longer need the outside world to agree with what you know is true inside you. This is a quieter, less dramatic sign than the others, but Jung considered it one of the most important. Because the need to convince others is actually a subtle form of psychological dependency. As long as you need someone else to validate your awakening, you're still tethered to external authority. When that tether dissolves, you're standing on your own ground for perhaps the first time. And that shift, that quiet arrival at inner authority, means the awakening is reaching layers that go far deeper than belief or understanding. It's reaching the foundational relationship you have with your own knowing. If something in what we've been exploring is landing in a place that feels almost too accurate, that recognition itself is worth paying attention to. There's our guide called True Self-Discovery, built around 24 reflection exercises drawn from the same Jungian principles we're exploring here. It was designed for exactly this kind of moment, when you can feel that the process isn't finished, but you need something concrete to work with while it unfolds. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. The fifth sign is that your body has become louder than your mind. Before the awakening, you probably lived mostly in your head, thinking, analyzing, planning, solving. Your body was just the thing that carried your brain around. But somewhere in the process, that hierarchy started reversing. Now your body speaks first. You feel tension before you think a thought. You notice a knot in your stomach before you recognize you're in an unsafe situation. Your chest tightens around certain people before your mind has formed an opinion about them. Energy drops, headaches, fatigue that doesn't correlate with how much sleep you got. Your body has become almost impossibly communicative, and you're still learning its language. Psychological transformation always eventually moves from the mental into the somatic. The psyche doesn't live only in your thoughts. It lives in your nervous system, your muscles, your gut, your bones. And when deep unconscious material begins surfacing during awakening, it doesn't always come as insight or emotion. Sometimes it comes as physical sensation. Sometimes the body processes what the mind isn't ready to understand yet. This is why so many people in the middle of awakening develop mysterious physical symptoms that doctors can't explain. Chronic fatigue, digestive issues, unexplained pain, sleep disruption. These aren't necessarily medical problems, though they should always be checked. Often they're the body metabolizing psychological material that's been stored somatically for years. The tension in your shoulders might be decades of hypervigilance finally releasing. The exhaustion might be your nervous system recalibrating after a lifetime of operating in survival mode. The digestive issues might be your gut literally processing what your conscious mind has been unable to digest. Jung would have understood these symptoms not as setbacks, but as evidence that the awakening has moved past the surface layers of belief and identity and into the deeper territory of the body itself. When your body becomes louder than your mind, it means the transformation is no longer just psychological. It's becoming cellular, and that's a sign that the process is reaching places most people's awakenings never touch. Not because the process isn't available, but because most people abandon it before it gets this deep. The sixth sign is that you keep being drawn back to wounds you thought were healed. You did the work on that childhood trauma. You processed the grief from that relationship. You understood the pattern, named it, worked through it in therapy or through your own deep reflection. It was done. You moved on. And now, months or years into your awakening, the same wound shows up again. Not identical to before, deeper somehow. Like you're encountering the same injury but from a different angle, at a different depth, with different implications than you saw the first time. This is one of the most demoralizing experiences in the awakening process because it feels like regression. It feels like proof that the work didn't take, that you didn't really heal, that you're going in circles. People often lose faith at this stage. They conclude that healing is impossible, that some wounds are permanent, that the awakening has stalled because it keeps returning them to the same places. But Jung saw this pattern as something completely different. He described the process of individuation as a spiral, not a line. You don't move through your psychology in a straight trajectory, hitting each wound once and leaving it behind forever. You move in circles that gradually deepen. Each time you return to a familiar wound, you're not in the same place you were before. You're encountering it from a more developed consciousness. You're able to see dimensions of it that were invisible the first time. You're ready for a layer of truth that would have been too destabilizing earlier in the process. The daughter who processed her mother's emotional absence at 25 understood it as rejection. At 35, after years of awakening, she returns to the same wound, and now she sees something she couldn't see before. She sees how her mother's absence shaped her entire relational template, how she's been unconsciously recreating that absence in every intimate relationship, how the wound isn't just about her mother anymore. It's woven into the architecture of how she loves, what she expects, what she tolerates, and what she runs from. This isn't the same wound. It's the same origin point at a completely different depth. When old wounds resurface during awakening, it means the process has circled back because you're now strong enough to face what you couldn't face before. It means the awakening isn't repeating itself, it's deepening. And the material coming up now isn't left over from incomplete healing. It's new territory that only becomes accessible after the earlier layers have been cleared. The seventh sign is that you've stopped being afraid of yourself. This one is subtle, and it often goes unnoticed because it doesn't announce itself the way the other signs do. It doesn't come with drama or crisis or waves of unexplainable emotion. It comes as a quiet shift in your relationship with your own interior. Where you used to avoid looking inward too closely, you now turn toward what's there with something approaching curiosity. Where certain thoughts or impulses used to terrify you, they now simply register as information. The parts of yourself you spent a lifetime running from have started to feel less like threats and more like rooms in a house you're finally willing to enter. Jung considered this shift to be one of the most significant markers of genuine transformation because it signals that shadow integration has moved from concept to lived experience. It's one thing to intellectually understand that you have a shadow. It's another thing entirely to sit with it without flinching, to feel the jealousy without judging it, to acknowledge the rage without being consumed by it, to look at the parts of you that are petty, selfish, hungry for control, capable of manipulation, and not collapse into shame or denial. Most people never reach this stage because the fear of their own darkness is too overwhelming. They build spiritual identities around being light, being loving, being good, and those identities function as walls that keep the shadow permanently locked away. The awakening began dismantling those walls, and what you're now experiencing, this unfamiliar willingness to face yourself completely, means the walls have come down far enough that the shadow is no longer something you flee from. It's something you're learning to live alongside. This was the real work of becoming whole, not eliminating the shadow, but integrating it. Not becoming a person without darkness, but becoming a person who contains their darkness consciously instead of being controlled by it unconsciously. And this integration doesn't happen in a single moment of confrontation. It happens gradually, over months and years of the awakening grinding away at your defenses until there's nowhere left to hide from yourself. If you've noticed that the things you used to be most afraid to look at inside yourself no longer carry the same charge, if you can sit with your own complexity without needing to resolve it into something simple and palatable, the awakening is still working. It's reached the deepest layer, the layer where you stop trying to be a good person and start learning to be a whole one. Here's what Jung ultimately understood about the process that connects all 7 of these signs. Awakening isn't a destination you arrive at. It's a restructuring of consciousness that operates on its own timeline, regardless of what you think should be happening. The in-between state, the intolerance for masks, the sourceless grief, the end of needing to convince anyone, the body becoming loud, the return of old wounds at new depths, the quiet dissolution of self-fear. These aren't separate experiences. They're all expressions of one continuous process working its way through every layer of who you are. The reason most people believe their awakening is over is that they confuse the end of the dramatic phase with the end of the process itself. The initial collapse gets all the attention. That's the part people write about, talk about, build identities around. But Jung observed that the dramatic collapse is just the opening act. The real transformation happens in the quieter phases that follow. The phases that look unremarkable from the outside. The phases where nothing seems to be happening, but everything is shifting underground. Think of it this way. The storm that cracked your life open was real. It was devastating. It got everyone's attention, including yours. But storms don't end when the wind stops. They end when the entire atmosphere has reorganized. And that reorganization happens quietly, gradually, in ways that are invisible to anyone who's only watching for drama. You're in that reorganization right now. The wind has died down, but the atmosphere is still shifting. The clouds are still moving. The pressure is still adjusting. And the mistake would be to look at the relative calm and conclude that the weather has settled. It hasn't. It's still in motion. You're still in motion. And the signs we've been exploring today are proof of that movement, even when it feels like nothing is happening. Jung spent decades watching people abandon their transformation at exactly this stage. They survived the crisis. They did the initial work. And then the quieter, deeper phase began, and they mistook it for stagnation. They went back to their old lives, their old patterns, their old personas. Not all the way back, because you can never fully return once the awakening has started, but far enough back that the deeper work never completed. Far enough back that they spent the rest of their lives sensing that something was left unfinished without ever understanding what it was. You don't have to make that choice. Understanding that these signs indicate ongoing transformation rather than failure or stagnation changes your relationship with the entire process. You stop fighting the in-between. You stop pathologizing the grief. You stop panicking about the body symptoms. You stop assuming that returning to old wounds means you haven't healed. You start recognizing all of it as one coherent process that your psyche is orchestrating with more intelligence than your conscious mind could ever manage. Jung trusted the psyche's capacity for self-healing more than he trusted any technique or intervention. He believed that the unconscious contained not just wounds, but the wisdom to heal those wounds, and that the process of individuation, when it was allowed to unfold without being interrupted or rushed, moved with a kind of organic intelligence toward wholeness. Not perfection, wholeness. The integration of every part, including the parts that are painful, dark, contradictory, and unresolved. Your job isn't to direct this process. Your job is to stop resisting it, to let the grief come when it comes, to honor the body's communication even when it's inconvenient, to sit in the in-between without grabbing for a premature answer, to trust that the return of old wounds means you're deepening, not regressing, to recognize that losing patience with inauthenticity is your psyche protecting the new territory it's claimed, to understand that not needing to convince anyone means you're finally standing on ground that doesn't require external support. The storm isn't over, but you're not where you were when it started. You've survived the part that everyone fears, the part that looks like destruction from the outside. What's happening now is the part no one talks about because it doesn't make for dramatic storytelling. The slow, quiet, unglamorous work of becoming real, of letting every false structure finish collapsing, of allowing whatever is genuinely yours to emerge at its own pace, in its own time, without forcing it into a shape that makes other people comfortable. The most important thing you can do right now is stay with the process, not push it, not perform completion you haven't reached, not pretend you've arrived somewhere stable when the ground is still shifting. Just stay with it. Let it work. Let it take as long as it takes. Because what's on the other side of this isn't a fixed identity or a permanent state of peace. It's something more valuable than either of those things. It's you. Not the version of you that was built to survive someone else's expectations. Not the version that performed wellness because the alternative was too frightening. The actual, unedited, fully dimensional version that's been underneath all of it this entire time, waiting for exactly this process to strip away everything that was never really yours. That version doesn't need to convince anyone, doesn't need to perform healing it hasn't completed, doesn't need the storm to be over before it can begin living. It just needs you to stop mistaking the quiet middle for the end. Because it's not the end, it's the deepest part, and you're already in it. If this resonated with where you are right now, if it named something you've been feeling but couldn't quite articulate, the True Self-Discovery Guide was built for this exact phase. 24 Jungian reflection exercises designed to give you something to work with while the process unfolds. Not to rush it, to meet it. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.